am climbing up the mountain, gonna find an answer. I am climbing up the mountain, gonna find an answer.
Along with Andrew, whom you've already met, our new friend Greg Castillo also curated this exhibit, Hippie Modernism, The Struggle for Utopia.
That's right. It is a struggle for utopia, as we well know.
Are we still struggling for utopia?
I think that there's no end to the struggle for utopia. That's what makes it utopia.
Yeah, okay. It's like the end of the rainbow, the elusive end of the rainbow. We just keep
Exactly.
chasing, but the
Exactly.
chase is where the spirit
Yeah,
is.
that's what defines you, whether you chase or not. Yeah.
It's an MO. It's an agenda. It's a purpose.
Yeah. It's basically life.
It's life, the struggle. So here's what we want to know, first and foremost. How have the movements of the 60s influenced our culture today that's still relevant, resonates?
Well, I think probably one of the most important ways is the culture of resistance. I mean, counterculture people were not subcultural. They didn't fly under the radar. They were right out there creating a new kind of culture which was intended to resist. And so one of the ways in which they did that, of course, was the anti-war movement, which is incredibly important. And also one of the things that we would not have today if it wasn't for the counterculture really is ecology. Ecology as not just a science, but as a lifestyle, as a way of dedicating yourself to preventing the destruction of the planet. And the reason I pulled you over here is I wanted to show you some works by an amazing artist from who now lives in Inverness, Gordon Ashby, who actually trained with the Eames Studio, one of the most important sort of originators of American modernism, Venice, California, moved to San Francisco, started working in design, and had his own pro bono design service called Transformer. So you can see here a number of posters he did. One, they're all based on mandalas. So here's a 19th century Indian mandala that's a Hindu religious object, and below we can see the counterculture mandala, that tiny dot of LSD, which was what blew open new worldviews. So Gordon Ashby continued to do his work, and he devoted himself to ecology. So here we can see his solution, be a transformer, evolve the new spirit, a beautiful poster that shows a central eye, to be understood as the way you see, but also the eye, and around it figures that show us that if we start to coexist with nature, as nature flourishes, the human heart will grow larger. Gordon Ashby ended up working with a brand new California organization, more or less run for and by hippies, that was the Office of Appropriate Technology. Here we see a Gordon Ashby poster for the Office of Appropriate Technology showing people how through various low-tech means they can make their house passive solar, they can reduce their water use, they can have a better life, and they can save money all at the same time. This was a really important, it was a world first, the Office of Appropriate Technology, created by Jerry Brown, a figure from this counterculture era. And politically interesting that it was the very first California office that a new Republican governor, Governor Deukmejian, essentially pulled the plug on when he became governor. That's why we don't have an Office of Appropriate Technology today.
But what we do have today is an environmental movement, so we can thank them for that.
Yeah.
And why is it so difficult to make caring for our planet, the precious planet that nurtures and sustains our life, so why is it so difficult for that to become mainstream?
Well, because there are so many businesses that are premised, part of their business plan entails the demolition of the planet for profit. So as long as planetary demolition is profitable, there's going to be a lot of money behind sort of attempting to make global warming a kind of myth that some scientists believe in but others don't. That's, of course, we know that's bullshit. But that's, of course, the problem that we face.
And they knew that back then in the 60s.
Absolutely knew it back then. These people went to the design conference at Aspen. They disrupted it based on wanting designers not to collaborate with the destruction of the planet. They were really shut down. But that in 1970 was one of the first mentions in a public forum of the dangers of global warming through carbon dioxide pollution. Of course, the establishment response is, anyone who thinks that carbon dioxide is a pollutant really is showing the most incredible levels of ignorance. That was the line at the time, and according to some people, still is.
Yeah, we breathe it out every time, right?
Exactly, it's natural.
How can that be bad? So it's been half a century. These issues seem, God, fundamental to our way of life, just having a planet to live on. We've been at it for half a century. What's it going to take?
Well, it will take people like these people who dedicated their lives to a kind of pro bono struggle for ecology to really make sure that we push this along and insist that planetary destruction is not a, good business model for anyone by doing everything we have to do to stop that.
Certainly not sustainable, literally.
Yeah, literally unsustainable.
Yeah. Why don't we turn to the cards for a few
let's
interesting
turn to the
questions? Here's one. Considering all the conversations about peace that were happening in the 60s, why do you think we become so comfortable in our current seemingly endless cycles of war?
Well, I mean, that's another way in which the counterculture was an interesting and really important culture of resistance. It was about love.
Love as resistance.
Love as resistance, and actually fear as a means of creating compliance, as we see every day, is really useful. If you want to make people behave in certain ways, make them afraid. The counterculture stood for a revolution in which, in a sense, like Jesus, they were proclaiming the revolutionary power of love. And it was a message that was easy to make fun of, as hippies always seem to be made fun of today.
And here the Beatles came along and they were the biggest thing since Jesus. And what did they say?
All you need is love.
Thank you. So it's obviously some inherent wisdom to the culture, counterculture culture.
Sure. It's age-old wisdom, really. Yeah.
Well, we love that too. How in the 60s they really seemed to embrace that ancient wisdom, Native American wisdom,
Right.
Buddhist and Eastern, contexts.
Yeah, and that was a very Californian.
philosophy.
It's a very Californian thing too. Like even the Beats before the hippies were very invested in kind of the discovery of Asian culture, of Tibetan Buddhism, the Book of the Dead. All of those things were really important to them.
And they literally passed the torch right on to the next generation at the Human Being,
Yep.
January 14th, 1967.
Yeah, you know your history.
Well, we were at the 50th anniversary a couple of weeks ago. So, how about this? 60s counterculture suggested we need to get beyond mindless consumerism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, do you think that humanity, especially Americans, can do that?
Well, I think one of the things that counterculture did is they essentially through poverty went back to the resource chain and they stuck their hands into what was supposed to be untouchable, which was junk, trash, material that had already been used once. That was supposed to simply disappear from sight in landfills. Two of the things they did is they brought our attention to the fact that landfills are a new kind of human geography that was being created, and insisted that, in the words of Lloyd Kahn, the only growing resource is trash. So if you look at our show, we have a number of images of houses that were mainly built out of recycled materials. This was a really important quality of hippie culture. Even if you look at clothing that's kind of pulled from the thrift store, not just as a way of dressing in rags, but creating a really resplendent fashion statement from what you can find there. that isn't manufactured for your use and fast fashion thrown away after 3 uses, but really is a reclaiming of those objects and creating something new from them.
No cotton plants or sheep were harmed in the making of this garment.
Exactly.
Well, they were, but it was for the last guy, so it's okay now. It was made anyway.
It's done. It's a done deal. Let's reuse it.
Yeah, no, they're just these concepts. It's hard to fathom that these simple concepts of recycle, reuse, creative use of things, innovative application of our resources was something that just came along in the 60s.
Well, I mean, you have to keep in mind that this notion of recycling was really a kind of in-your-face moment, because these were the children of the post-war period. It was the moment of, like, American affluence, the greatest moment of consumerism probably that the world has ever known. So in making these choices, and they were choices, they were saying, no, I refuse to do that.
I want to slap my head right now.
New.
Yes. Hey, we dropped the atom bomb. We're the richest, most powerful country in the world. Let's waste some shit.
Right.
Let's
And
destroy
actually,
it.
there's a really interesting story about these hippie buildings. They were picked up as part of an exhibition in France that was created by a curator, Jean Detier, for the American Cultural Center. He created a show about alternative architecture in America, and when it went up in the American Cultural Center, the ambassador to France was so outraged that in 1975, America, the greatest nation in the world, the mightiest nation, would be represented by shanties made out of trash and bare-breasted hippies, that he first shut down the show, then fired the director of the American Cultural Center. Well, that show, because it did not belong to the American Cultural Center, went on the road. The American ambassador had unwittingly created such PR for it by shutting it down that show traveled through Europe until 1979, when literally the photographs and boards were falling apart. It was seen by hundreds of thousands of people. So this was another way in which this kind of counterculture and its lifestyle were almost unwittingly kind of spread across international boundaries so people could see what was happening on the ground in America.
It's a beautiful thing, any press is good press, and just to see counterculture flourish in this way.
Absolutely.
I mean, tie-dye is a pretty mainstream. Smoking
totally
weed is pretty mainstream. It's legal now.
Yeah, and actually, that's an interesting point about how things have changed. Timothy Leary was sent up for 20 years in prison and the equivalent of about $5 million of bail for the possession of 3 burned-down marijuana roaches. It's hard now to understand the risk that people took just by smoking pot. They were made criminals. They were criminalized, and the sort of impact of that would be to destroy a life. And so, in a sense, that was a form of resistance. And now look at California. It's a totally different world, and it's a different world because those people were willing to take those risks.
Well, we just love reliving all this spirit of the hippies, the 60s, the counterculture movements, the love movement. If not now, when? 50 years later, can we have a resurgence?
I guess we're going to find out, aren't we? Let's try. Let's see what happens after the Summer of Love's 50th anniversary. I'll be there.
Good. We will too, and we plan to live on at S.O.U.L. And at S.O.U.L, we always love to wrap with a hug.
Thank you.